Welcome to the second in our new series of discussions of new publications by the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California. Our topic today is a new publication entitled Major Power Rivalry and Nuclear Risk Reduction: Perspectives from Russia, China, and the United States. This is a collection of 3 essays. We'll be hearing from each of the 3 authors, but separately rather than as a panel, given the complications of time zones. First up is the US perspective. Let me introduce Dr. Lewis Dunn, former ambassador for Nonproliferation and a leading US thinker on nuclear strategy. Lewis, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Brad.
Thank you. Please tell us a little bit about your background.
Okay, I guess in terms of nuclear issues and strategic issues, my background goes way back to Hudson Institute in the 1970s, in the institute created by Herman Kahn, who had thought about all these strategic issues. I then went into the Reagan administration, where I was eventually assistant director of the US Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and ambassador to the 1985 NPT Review Conference. I then went to Science Applications International Corporation, a consulting firm involved in all sorts of things related to national security, where I was for about 30 years doing work on nonproliferation, nuclear nonproliferation treaty, arms control, US, Russia, all sorts of security issues and foreign policy issues. I retired a couple of years ago from SAIC, and have basically been doing some consulting and freelance writing ever since. A long period involved.
And that work currently focuses heavily on nuclear risk reduction. What's brought you to that focus at this time?
Well, I came into the risk reduction area from 2 different channels. On the one hand, with my work on the nuclear nonproliferation treaty, it was quite clear by the time we were into the early 2010s that the non-nuclear weapon states were very concerned about the risk of use of nuclear weapons and the impact of any use of nuclear weapons. And this led me to believe that the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states, China, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Russia, should be doing more to talk to each other about how did they reduce the risk of use of nuclear weapons, basically as a response to this concern amongst non-nuclear weapon states that there was a high risk. The other channel, though, was for the past decade plus, I've been heavily involved in trying to think about how the United States and Russia and the United States and China could begin some type of process of mutual strategic reassurance to try to convince each other that the uncertainties that they have about the other's intentions and capabilities can be managed. And this focus on the United States and Russia and the United States and China has increasingly led me to believe that there's a growing risk that some type of a conventional confrontation, conflict, could then escalate to the nuclear threshold. So from that other perspective, I became involved in thinking about, well, how could you reduce the risk of use of nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, or the United States and China, or in other contexts like with India and Pakistan, both of whom are involved in nuclear competition, and both of whom have on occasion gone to major crises. So that was how I focused on it. And then you asked me to do a paper for you.
There's that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that paper? What are its main messages and what makes it particularly important at this time?
Well, I think the starting point for the paper was to ask how might the use of nuclear weapons, and by use of nuclear weapons, I mean employment in a conflict. I don't mean what people often say, nuclear weapons are used every day because, we're always deterring. I mean actual use where there is a detonation and the like. So looking at how the use of nuclear weapons could come about, it struck me that the most credible pathway was through some type of escalating conflict. So the paper looks at different ways in which a crisis between the United States and Russia, the United States and China, or India and Pakistan could begin to escalate, first to more intense crisis, then into conventional confrontation, then into conventional conflict, and then reaching the nuclear threshold at which the possibility of use of nuclear weapons would be seriously on the table. In that discussion, I emphasized the importance, in particular, of misperceptions on the part of any one of these players as to how the other thinks about use of nuclear weapons, misperceptions of how particular conventional military actions could be viewed, and then miscalculations, as well as incidents. So based on this look at the way in which a crisis or conflict could escalate towards the nuclear threshold, the paper then sets out three different baskets of approaches for how could one try to reduce the risk of use of nuclear weapons. The first basket focuses upon bilateral engagement, particularly between the United States and Russia and the United States and China, arguing that bilateral engagement, sustained, serious, high-level engagement involving defense, military, and nuclear people in the United States and Russia, the United States and China, would be the best way to try to reduce the risk of a conventional conflict escalating towards and over the nuclear threshold. In that context, the paper sets out, okay, if there is this type of high-level engagement, what gets discussed? Well, from a risk reduction perspective, start by discussing how might a conventional conflict come about and begin to escalate towards the nuclear threshold. Continue on to discuss what are the types of misperceptions and miscalculations that might exist, which could fuel this escalatory process. Where does the United States think that something would be a way to show resolve, and the Russians or the Chinese might think of this as highly dangerous and escalatory? So in that context, the paper then focuses upon, are there specific actions that the two countries could take? In this context, in the bilateral engagement section of the paper, I argue that the United States and Russia ought to go back. In the early 70s, there were a series of war prevention, nuclear war prevention, accident and incident agreements between the United States and the then Soviet Union. And I argue that the United States and Russia ought to go back and look at these things again and update them. And then you could, if you could update them, you could invite China to join in any such updating. You can invite China before that to participate in a discussion amongst, senior American defense and foreign policy officials on any one of these agreements and how you might update it to deal with risk today. In this context, I also suggest, and I won't go into it, that with regard to the Chinese, we ought to think seriously at the Chinese proposal for some type of a bilateral U.S.-Russia, no first use of nuclear weapons agreement between the two countries, U.S. and Russia. Not a global agreement, but an agreement just between us and China that neither of us will use nuclear weapons first against the other. So that's sort of the first basket. The second basket then says, doing bilateral engagement could turn out to be very difficult. For for a variety of reasons. Clearly, it's hard to have bilateral engagement now. So where do the United States and Russia and the United States and China actually talk about these issues? They do it in what's known as the P5 process. This is this process in which the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, who also have nuclear weapons, come together. So it's a set of discussions for over a decade between same cast of characters, you know, China, France, United Kingdom, Russia, and the United States. And in this P5 process, there's been some discussion of doctrine, the nuclear doctrine, some engagement whereby one P5 member sets out its doctrine and others ask questions. And it seemed to me that this is an opportunity that ought to be seized. There's ways in which you could build on the P5 discussions to go into a much more serious and sustained discussion of crisis avoidance, crisis management, and risk reduction. The agenda would look a lot like the agenda between the United States and Russia, or the United States and China. If you could do bilateral engagement, you know, how could a conventional crisis escalate? Where are there miscalculations? What misperceptions could play a role? But if the P5 process remains basically the only game in town to discuss risk reduction, let's do it in the P5 process. Even if it becomes possible to do bilateral engagement, the paper argues that you should still do more in the P5 process because it could tee up issues, it could raise questions, it could show the importance of bilateral engagement. Now, to use the P5 process, I acknowledge that what you need to do is to transform it. For the most part, although this has been changing, for the most part, the P5 process has been diplomats, NPT diplomats. So you would want to bring in more military people, more nuclear people, more people with hands-on experience in the feeding and watering of nuclear forces, and change it in that way. So that's the second basket. The third basket is for the better part of a decade. It seemed to me that one of the things that would be useful for the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states to do would be to talk to themselves about what are the responsibilities that they have as long as they possess nuclear weapons. Now, you can't just talk amongst the 5, so you really do have to bring in India and Pakistan. So the third basket argues that the 5 nuclear weapon states with India and Pakistan should engage in a discussion of a code of nuclear responsibilities. What are the responsibilities that they should bear as they think about everything related to their nuclear weapons activities? From how do they make decisions about what forces to procure? What type of decision do they make about their posture and their operations? What do they do with regard to decision making? What are their responsibilities with regard to safety, security, command and control? And in this part of the paper, I set out one view, because there are other views, one view of what a set of responsibilities might be, ranging from trying to exercise restraint in nuclear posture choices, trying to have greater transparency in those posture choices so that you will not unintentionally fuel some type of arms competition, through safety and security, best practices there, and so a whole set of different responsibilities. One of the responsibilities that I set out is that the 5 nuclear weapon states in India and Pakistan should basically declare that the purpose of nuclear weapons is deterrence. Deterrence, not use. deterrence. And that this is different, though, from the argument that you hear that the purpose of nuclear weapons, the only purpose of nuclear weapons should be to deter the use of nuclear weapons. I think that's a bridge too far. I don't think you can sell it in the United States, but you conceivably could sell the proposition that nuclear weapons purpose should be for deterrence. That's why you acquire them. That's why you posture them. That's why you have a capability, if deterrence fails, to use them. And thus that leaves open deterrence of what? It leaves that ambiguous. So that's the third basket of the paper that's in there. And it was great fun to do because it gave me the opportunity to sit down and think through an issue that I'd been, thinking here, thinking there for the better part of a decade. So that's a kind of long-winded description of what's in the paper, in greater detail, though, in the paper.
But it's a very interesting description and very clear and compelling. Thank you. One thing that struck me about the tone of your essay was that it struck all three of the contributions are very realistic about the challenges to cooperation among the three on nuclear risk reduction, but all three are in fact cautiously optimistic, it seems to me. And your paper conveys some cautious optimism about not just the utility of the agenda you've set out, but the practicality of making some positive steps forward on it in the near to medium term. What's the source of that optimism? Cautious optimism.
I think it's hard to be optimistic, let alone cautiously optimistic today, given that the arms control relationship for 5 decades between the United States and Russia is threatened with collapse, given how hard it has been to try to convince the Chinese that the United States and China really need to talk with each other about reassuring each other in this area. Notwithstanding those reasons for pessimism, it strikes me that the fundamental reason for optimism is that none of these countries, the United States, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, none of them have an interest in a nuclear war breaking out. I think my own personal view is that, notwithstanding speculation, particularly amongst American experts and Russian experts, and some American military and some Russian military, about the possibility of a limited nuclear war, it strikes me that that's an oxymoron, that the risk of escalation, if nuclear weapons are ever used to a major nuclear war, is so great. And it seems to me that uncertainty about could you use nuclear weapons in a limited way, and that also applies in Pakistan and India, where the Pakistanis think they could use nuclear weapons in a limited way and sort of show the Indians what for and have some sort of conventional conflict then. But so it seems to me that first, the uncertainties about, gee whiz, could you actually use these weapons in a limited way and get away with it, combined with a recognition on the part, I believe, of all of these nuclear weapon states that nuclear war, if you mean by that large scale nuclear exchanges, even tens of weapons, forget tens of weapons, would be totally self-destructive. And so, to my mind, that shared interest in avoiding the massive destruction of even limited nuclear use, meaning a few nuclear weapons, more, large, tens of weapons, is a big incentive for them to come together and talk. Now, there are other incentives which make me cautiously optimistic, which are less substantive and more political. If you take the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states, They have a strong interest in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty as the foundation for their efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. The non-nuclear weapon states are very, very concerned about the risk of use of nuclear weapons. So for the 5 nuclear weapon states, either together or for the 5 nuclear weapon states, both together and bilaterally, to demonstrate that, hey, we understand that the use of nuclear weapons would be a big disaster. And here, we understand that there are ways in which a conventional conflict could escalate to that. So we are working together to prevent and minimize that risk. We'll strengthen the NPT. So for the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states, that's a political interest, aside from the fact that if nuclear weapons were ever used, my own view is that the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states would find themselves having their day ruined. For India and Pakistan, there also is a political interest in trying to engage on this issue through the venue of some type of a discussion of a code of nuclear responsibilities. It's a recognition that they're nuclear weapon states. And actually, that's why a whole bunch of non-nuclear weapon state officials oppose the idea of engaging India and Pakistan on anything related to reducing nuclear risk, because it in effect says, okay, they're nuclear weapon states. So that's for them, there's a kind of political incentive. There's another political incentive which exists in India, but not in Pakistan. For the Indians, it means if they get to participate in a dialogue amongst what would be the 7 on reducing nuclear risks, they're being taken seriously by the Chinese, which is an important political consideration. So this makes me kind of cautiously optimistic, or optimistically pessimistic, or whatever however you want to put it. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you for this quick introduction to your contribution to this volume. In closing, is there anything else you'd like to add to the discussion?
No, I'm just happy to have done it. It was a fun piece, and I think it came out of a first-class workshop, and it's an important area to just keep pushing thinking along. Yeah.
Thank you, Lewis. Thank you, Dr. Lewis Dunn. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your contribution to the volume, and we'll move on to our second interview momentarily. Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye.